Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, editor for Shadowproof. Welcome to this conversation. I'm going to be talking to two exceptional guests about a lawsuit related to the civil liberties and the constitutional rights of water protectors involved in the indigenous-led Standing Rock movement. To introduce them, first we have Noah Smith-Drelich, who is a lecturer in who is with Chicago Kent. He's an assistant professor of law at Chicago Kent, and then before that, he was a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, and before that, an ACLU staff attorney for the North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming affiliates. Welcome, Noah.
Thanks, Kevin. It's good to be here.
And then Bernard Harcourt is a professor, and sorry, I don't have your stuff handy in this press release that I'm going through, Bernard, but you are based in New York. You spent some time in Chicago, and you're involved in representing the plaintiffs in this lawsuit with Noah. So thank you for joining.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having us.
And feel free to, fill in any additional background details about how you come to this lawsuit if you want, Bernard. But to begin, I just want to establish for people who likely are unaware that this has been unfolding what the nature of this case is. Maybe Noah, you want to outline the specific details of the case. This lawsuit against the sheriff of Morton County and other local authorities, as well as TigerSwan, which is a private security company that alleges that First and 14th Amendment rights of the water protectors were infringed upon. Can you outline some of the basics of this, Noah?
Yeah, so at Standing Rock, as part of the No DAPL movement in 2016 and 2017, a lot of people have heard about the excessive force that police used. I think fewer people have heard about one of the other primary ways that the local law enforcement and government worked to try to chill the No DAPL movement. And that was that they closed the primary road into and out of the reservation. This was Highway 1806. And they closed it for 5 months. And they didn't close it to everyone. They really just closed it to the tribe and its supporters. So if you were a white local resident, you could use the road. If you were affiliated with the pipeline construction company, you could use the road. But if you were a water protector, you couldn't. This was a big problem for a number of reasons, including that not just that this is the primary road, so it made living on the reservation and as well as at the camps on the reservation border. This is the Ocheti Shakoi camp, Rosebud camp, Sacred Stones camp, all the camps there. It made living there significantly more difficult because it cut off the primary route to Bismarck Mandan. But it was also a problem because an area alongside the road where the pipeline was originally slated to come through and then eventually did come through was one of the primary areas where folks went to speak and pray in opposition to the pipeline. This is a fairly common thing in many areas of the country, is that roadside locations are historically one of the primary public forums that people will go to speak and picket, things of that nature. So the local authorities and the state government as well didn't like this happening, and so rather than just come out and say it, they closed the forum entirely, which you can't do. So the closure of the road, the 5-month-long discriminatory closure of the road, is what the lawsuit is about.
Mm-hmm. And so TigerSwan, this private security company, what sort of conduct are they implicated in as far as this lawsuit goes? Because they come in and are essentially singling out alleged threats as a justification for this crackdown, right?
Yeah, so the governments in question and the sheriff in question, who all worked to close the road, have used a number of different pretexts to justify the road closure. But one of the primary things that they've argued across is is that the No DAPL movement was a violent and dangerous movement. Now, that's just simply put not true. But a lot of that comes from TigerSwan. So during the time in question, TigerSwan was acting as like an intelligence coordinator, coordinating a lot of the like intelligence gathering for different private security companies. They worked hand in hand with law enforcement, including Morton County specifically, to do a lot of intelligence gatherings. They had operatives in the camps, and they were passing along that intelligence. Obviously, TigerSwan, who is employed by Energy Transfer Partners, the company constructing the pipeline, doesn't do things that's in the public interest. They were doing things that were in their clients' interest, the pipeline companies. And yet they were working really as like in a very, very close, a closely entangled, entwined way with the law enforcement there, passing along, I think, often intentionally bad or misleading intelligence to try to achieve their goals, which was to facilitate the pipeline's construction at all costs. And so they really are a central part of everything that's going on down there, and specifically, I think, a central part of the road closure through their work with the law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. And let me bring in Bernard into this conversation and just ask in a larger sense what you think this partnership represents as far as the trend toward turning to these private security companies for assistance when it comes to dealing with, well, I suppose, given your writings, that you could say the local governments view these people as a kind of insurgency that they have to counter as far as maintaining order in their community. But I would add that we've seen in the last year several moments where dissent has broken out, whether we're talking about Black Lives Matter protests or any kinds of protests that might be people perhaps demanding some kind of assistance. We could potentially see future protests similar to what we saw with Occupy back in 2011, potentially, given the economic crisis as it gets more stiff. And it just seems that this partnership between TigerSwan and the local government there in North Dakota, while it seems to, well, definitely targets indigenous people, it more than anything seems representative of these partnerships that are developing.
Right. Well, thanks, Kevin. And you're right to bring up the larger political context surrounding the kind of actions at Standing Rock. I mean, it's important in a way to kind of distinguish the narrower legal questions, which Noah was presenting perfectly. He's lead counsel on this, and with his experience at the ACLU previously, and of course, with his teaching now at Kent, he's really formulated the legal aspects perfectly. And of course, they address those questions of free speech and assembly related to the road closure. But you're right to bring out the fact that it fits within a much broader context, a much broader political context. A broader political context that is, as you suggest, precisely about the way in which private security forces are now working with public safety agencies to kind of to crack down on certain kinds of protests in this country, using a framework, kind of a paradigm of counterinsurgency warfare. We saw that at Standing Rock with TigerSwan, and of course the Intercept and yourself made several exposés about the documents that were obtained from TigerSwan, and there were their memos and their internal memos, which showed that basically they had a counterinsurgency warfare mentality and practices that they were deploying at Standing Rock, and so, as you know, you recall the history of TigerSwan, and of course this is this much broader kind of political context. The history of TigerSwan is that it was originally a private security firm out in the wars in Iraq and whatnot. And they were they came back to the United States and basically started to apply those same logics and practices and mentalities to the policing of and surveillance of Standing Rock, the Standing Rock water protectors. And so we saw in the expose of their internal memos the way in which they were talking about the Standing Rock water protectors as jihadists and using all of the same language and counterinsurgency practices in terms of infiltration, in terms of trying to create rifts within the camps, etc., that are classic counterinsurgency tools. So the case is of course on free speech and First Amendment rights, narrowly construed, and I think as a legal matter, there's really no question that we will prevail here. The road closure was an extraordinary closure of a public road, basically, which is the most well accepted, and we can talk about that. Noah can talk about that. The most well accepted kind of public forum for First Amendment purposes. So from a legal perspective, it's pretty clear that there were First Amendment violations. But from the broader, larger perspective, you're entirely right that this really reflected a change in the way policing particularly of protest in this country has been transformed over the last few years, particularly since 9/11. And I think that this case in particular, right, in parallel with the militarized, hyper-militarized responses, say, to Black Lives Matter protests, and in sharp contrast to what we saw at the Capitol during the insurrection in January, shows exactly how the policing is being transformed today towards this kind of militarized counterinsurgency response for certain kinds of protests and not for others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously entirely outside the scope of your case, but just for some context, I want to note for people that we have an example of essentially something called a geofence warrant being used on Black Lives Matter protesters in Minneapolis. I mean, I presume that when you look at the Standing Rock protests, those are things that you're kind of interested in, like what was the extent to which people within a geographic region were being targeted? Because in this example of and I'm not expecting you to comment on it. I'm just throwing it out here, and then we'll get back to the specifics of your lawsuit. But for people who are following this and are concerned with the larger issues outside the scope of your specific case, we have this being reported that police were able to get a search warrant that ordered Google to provide account data on people who were near a protest. So in one general area, they were able to just target anyone who was in the vicinity that day to sweep up their personal data. And like you say about TigerSwan, one of the examples of abuse that I recall being mentioned in the reporting and maybe alluded to in your own lawsuit when it was filed was that the company claimed to find Islamic individuals that were organizing, and they claimed that they were monitoring Shia Islamic people, and then it's said that I believe that this was their way of persistently and misleadingly labeling indigenous speech and prayer as somehow being riotous. And so this is really, I think, important, especially as we're seeing threats of alleged domestic terrorism be promoted in the country about, what kinds of real or imagined threats these private security companies are going to claim in order to justify what they're doing and their partnerships. But let me ask Noah about this, because I do recognize it in the press release for this, you're setting up what's going on with this legal case, that if I'm correct, the defendants are suggesting that they that the constitutional rights in question were not necessarily established, and that public roads were not public forums for speech prior to you filing this lawsuit. So what's your response to that? I assume you actually did respond to it formally in one of your reply briefs, but what's the implications for this kind of an argument, Noah?
Yeah, so the argument that you're alluding to is under this legal doctrine called qualified immunity. Now, if you haven't heard of qualified immunity, it's something that is getting more attention, in part because it is this incredibly powerful, essentially shield that public officials can use to avoid liability. It's created by the Supreme Court. It's not created by Congress. And the Supreme Court has essentially said that when a public official has violated your constitutional rights, you can't sue them and recover damages unless the rights in question were clearly established at the time that they were violated. Now, as you can imagine, that leads to a whole slew of different constitutional violations, times that we can all agree that people's rights were violated, that you're just out of luck. The courts essentially say, we acknowledge your rights were violated, but you can't recover anything for them. And I think people are just now starting to realize what that means for policing and movements and how big of a problem it is. So that's the doctrine they're making this argument under. So their specific argument is that that they should be allowed to do essentially whatever they want with respect to speech on the roads, if it's not clearly established that roads are public forums. That's a legal term. Public forums are places that are much more difficult for political actors to regulate speech in. So the question is it clearly established that roads are public forums? The answer to this, I think, is as clear as day. There may be no more clearly established rule than that roads are public forums. This is something the Supreme Court has said. I'm going to paraphrase or closely paraphrase the quote, but the Supreme Court has said that all public streets are public forums, that there is no particularized inquiry necessary into the precise nature of any given public street. Once we determine that it's a public street, the answer is it's a public forum. And there's a lot of good reasons for this, including that the Supreme Court recognizes that roads have this very strong historical use for speech. I think the Supreme Court is a little leery about what it might look like if courts have to go road by road. I think there's something like 50 million miles of roads in the US. And so it's the idea that every separate mile requires a new court to come in and say, well, is it clearly established that this road is a public forum? That's like an absurd sort of exercise given the long-standing historical use of just roads in general, all sorts of roads, big roads, small roads, rural roads, urban roads, for speech. So the Supreme Court has made like a very clear, bright line rule about this. So, I mean, I don't think their argument here is particularly compelling. They made the same argument in the district court in front of the federal district court judge. And the federal district court judge was not persuaded, so they're currently appealing it to the Eighth Circuit. I don't think that their argument's very persuasive. The ACLU wrote a brief that I think also adds to what we wrote in pointing out the many different ways that many different types of roads throughout the U.S. have been used for speech, including in the 1960s and the civil rights era for marches that often took people across roads that looked almost identical to the one at issue here. So that's the nature of their argument. And no, I don't think it's a particularly compelling argument, either as a factual matter, if we look at this specific road, or as a kind of broader legal matter, because again, the Supreme Court has just explicitly said that courts shouldn't be looking road by road and making this decision that all roads are traditional public forums.
Mm-hmm. And let me just, as I have it handy, share with people a bit from the ACLU brief. Again, this is pulled out in the press release that was sent out about the lawsuit, just mentioning, like, as you are saying here, that these are important sites of protest and have been in key points in American history. This includes civil rights marches. There's been anti-war demonstrations in the 1960s and 70s. There are more recent protests including marches in opposition to abortion and in support of rural healthcare and against police brutality. Of course, I'm well aware, having followed the Black Lives Matter protests, how these marches have taken to highways, and that has become a kind of focus, a kind of flashpoint between people over whether those kinds of demonstrations need to be restricted. But clearly, there's been some difficulty in being able to pass some kind of a law for the reasons that are cited in this ACLU brief. And ACLU argues that forcing courts to undertake a particularized inquiry for every road or sidewalk. So what you've been saying is something that would chill protest. So this is all really good and important background information to note. So let me ask about the fact that there's a trial, that you were able to get a trial right now, and it's set for August 2021. In terms of this kind of a case that we are looking at here, is it typical for a case like this to make it to that point, or should we feel like it was a victory for you to be granted an opportunity to take this to trial?
So I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Noah. Go ahead. I mean, it's important to kind of understand the litigation in terms of the role of the qualified immunity that Noah was just talking about, versus going forward against TigerSwan, who is not entitled to qualified immunity. So just to kind of reiterate what Noah was suggesting, but also to put it in context, the qualified immunity applies to public agencies, the governor, the state police, and the state and the county agencies who are entitled to qualified immunity in a situation like this, of course. And that qualified immunity is today one of the most important issues that needs to be rethought, re-examined, and changed. Because it's really a shield behind which all kinds of improper governmental behavior takes place, particularly police behavior. In our lawsuit, which was included defendants that were at the state level, defendants who were at the county level, and then, of course, TigerSwan, which is a private enterprise. TigerSwan doesn't benefit from qualified immunity, and so it's that part of the lawsuit that's moving forward toward trial in August. So go ahead, Noah, though, in continuing the thought.
Yeah. To clarify, we're moving forward toward trial against Morton County and TigerSwan, who neither of whom have the defense of qualified immunity available, with things being paused against the remaining defendants. But yeah, I think it's actually a very significant victory. Cases like this, the way they generally proceed is that defendants have, in effect, two real shots to get rid of a case before trial. And they are very serious real shots. Most cases don't make it to trial. So we've now passed that first gauntlet, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. So the defendants took their first shot. The district court didn't buy it. They said, no, this case gets to move forward. So we're now in what's called discovery. That's the point of the case that we have the legal power of the court behind us to request information from the defendants. We've done so against both Morton County and TigerSwan. Pending the resolution of this at the 8th Circuit, we will be in discovery against the remaining defendants. So being in the position that we are in, with trials scheduled in August against TigerSwan and Morton County, is I think very significant. It's significant as a legal matter because, again, we've survived this sort of first gauntlet. But it's also significant because now we're legally entitled to ask for all sorts of non-public information from both TigerSwan and Morton County. So assuming that they play by the rules, and if they do not, they will be sanctioned by the court, we will be getting lots of information from them that is pertinent to the lawsuit. I think is going to really cast a light on everything that has happened with at least that's relevant to our case.
And so obviously this discovery is, you have questions that if you're able to answer, you're going to be able to put forward a stronger case against these defendants, against TigerSwan and Morton County during trial. And so, like you said, you're entitled to this information. Do you foresee, though, that they would be able to frustrate your ability to get certain records because they claim that they're private, or are you pretty certain that you're going to be able to get to the universe of information that is necessary to prove what was going on in violation of the constitutional rights of these water protectors?
So one of the great things about discovery is that you can't shield information just because you claim that it's private. Do I think that they might try to frustrate discovery? I think it's possible. I mean, I hope not. Do I think they'll succeed? No, I don't. Courts are not very patient when parties try to play games in discovery and try to avoid their legal responsibilities. We have done an enormous amount of investigation in this case already and have already collected just a vast amount of information, which is helpful not only because we have a lot of what we already need to prove our case, but also because we have a pretty good understanding of what they have that we need, which makes it harder for them to not give it to us when we ask for it, because we know what we're looking for, we know what they have. And if they don't turn over information and documents that we know that they have, it's a little harder for them to say, oh, we didn't know, or we didn't have these, when we know that they do have them. So I'm at least optimistic that they won't succeed in frustrating the goals of discovery. Whether or not they'll try, again, I hope not, but we'll see.
And then before we would wrap our conversation here, I want to throw it to the more larger political issues that definitely entail the First Amendment, which is that now with Joe Biden as our president, there's obviously an opening felt by a lot of these indigenous water protectors. We saw the Keystone XL pipeline permit was tossed. We know now that there's going to be likely a resumed effort to challenge this pipeline as well as other pipelines. So this kind of a lawsuit is essentially protecting rights for people who in the future are going to need this kind of a lawsuit there to discourage local governments from taking preemptive action against them, to block them from engaging in their actions. I just, I wonder if there's anything you, this would be for both of you, if anything you want to say about how you recognize that this lawsuit could be a good precedent. It does seem like, as we talk about the partnerships that are developed between private security companies and local governments who want to lean on these outside firms in order to give them additional logistical support, or however they might frame it, that I don't know if there's been a whole lot of pushback on this. I'm not sure how many cases you can point to that actually draw boundaries around what they can get away with doing, or what they feel like they could get away with doing, simply because they've outsourced it. So I imagine that what Morton County was feeling is that by having TigerSwan do this, they might not, they could have possibly gotten away with never being held accountable by taxpayers or voters, because TigerSwan would be the one that you'd have to go after, and it would be really difficult to figure out what they were doing. The problem is now there's a lot of public reporting about what TigerSwan was involved in, and they pretty much lost the ability to keep that all secret from the public.
Yeah, so I guess maybe just to start off with, I think it's important to remember that a lot of what happened at Standing Rock happened under President Obama's administration. So the road was closed while President Obama was still acting president. That's not to say that there aren't major differences between President Obama's stance towards the No to Apple movement or the Water is Life movement and the stance that was taken subsequently by President Trump. I think there were massive differences that made huge impacts on the way policing happened and what sort of abuses were, what sort of abuses occurred. But this isn't to say that simply having a more progressive, maybe more rights respectful, at least certain set of rights respectful president in office isn't. It's not like that's the full solution, and that's partially because a lot of these things are really controlled at the state or local level. So we're not suing any federal parties. We're suing only state and county parties as well as TigerSwan. Even under a progressive federal administration, there's still an enormous amount of room that states and localities have to do these sorts of unconstitutional actions. But turning to your question about public-private partnerships, I guess another thing I maybe wanted to add about what happened at Standing Rock that I think hasn't gotten as much attention as it probably should is that one way that there was a public-private relationship at Standing Rock was through TigerSwan's interactions with the local policing. Another was simply that the pipeline company donated an enormous amount of money to state and local officials. So, and this is all public record. This isn't secret. I think it was announced in the Bismarck Tribune. The state of North Dakota got $15 million from Energy Transfer Partners to offset its policing costs. The city of Mandan, which is the biggest city of Morton County, got, I believe it was $3 million from Energy Transfer Partners. So we have this private security company employed by the pipeline construction company working hand in hand with local law enforcement. Like you're saying, I think there was a lot of outsourcing of things that maybe local law enforcement couldn't have done or would have potentially faced more liability had they done it directly. But we also have a circumstance in which the local government and the state government was directly receiving money from the pipeline company to offset their response. So no, I do think that, like, looking forward, I think that there is a lot of aspects of things that happen at Standing Rock that are incredibly concerning, and I think are concerning even under a Biden administration. I think if anything, since this all happened in 2016, 2017, there've been a lot more movements towards these sort of private-public partnerships, and a lot more movements by states to work on criminalizing speech. So South Dakota passed a riot boosting bill that imposes just vast liability on people for essentially speaking. And I think that there's reason to believe that there's more of that is going to come, in part on the heels of this, I think, largely legitimate fear of domestic terrorism that came out of the Capitol insurrection. But I worry a little bit about what that means for these sorts of movements and how those sorts of laws could be possibly used to criminalize constitutionally protected conduct and to chill such sort of speech, gathering, all the sorts of things what we really want to see. I worry about how especially states like North Dakota and South Dakota might use these sorts of laws against water protectors in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Noah's putting the spotlight really on two important dimensions here that need to be focused on, and the intersection of them is really important. One is kind of the political economy that makes it such that Energy Transfer Partners is hiring private security and participating in the economic life and the political life of these counties and states through which the pipeline is going, which creates these incentives and creates these material interests, right, in cracking down in this way on any kind of resistance to the pipeline. And then the other is the more policing aspects, some of which we just talked about, turn to counterinsurgency, both that is facilitated and made possible by the kind of cooperations between the private security and the public and state policing. So it's a combination of those two twin, in a way, twin evils that feed on each other and really brought us to this situation, I think. But it's important to stay focused on the fact that these are forces that in a way pre-existed the Trump administration, right, and still exist today, which are the economic forces that bring about these kind of private energy, state coalitions and agreements and shared interests on the one hand, and the shared policing interest in simply cracking down in this most really violent and brutal way on peaceful protest.
Mm-hmm. I think that's put well. Yeah, and obviously at this point, as far as the economy goes, and this is outside the narrow scope of your lawsuit, but oil and gas is in a much weaker state after 1 year of this COVID-19 pandemic. But that's also a reason why they're going to fight even harder for these projects that we're still in the middle of, and they're going to fight to complete those projects, and likely to the detriment of people who are practicing their First Amendment rights or want to go out there and engage in assembly to challenge, especially if, as we saw evidenced in this example of the Dakota Access Pipeline, that you had clear evidence of sacred land that should have never been granted access, that the oil and gas companies should have never been granted access to construction. And so that's, I think, why this kind of a lawsuit is important. In some ways, it seems, and maybe you'll want to respond to this, you have to create a cost for this egregious violation of First Amendment rights, because if you're not doing so, then if somehow it isn't substantial, either monetarily or reputationally to Energy Transfer Partners or others involved, then what success can you have in the way of challenging these projects so that they aren't undertaken? Because it does seem like one of the problems with these pipeline projects is that, and as far as protecting our rights goes, that they will undertake them even if they have a small success of being completed. And we've seen some of these projects are not actually being finished because they either lose money because there's divestment from financial institutions that no longer are willing to support them, or they run into their own roadblocks. But at that point, they've already destroyed land, and that's a huge hit for indigenous people who were trying to protect the ecosystem from being disrupted. I don't know if yeah, go ahead, Noah.
No, and I mean, there's again, all in the public record. The folks who led the policing response at Standing Rock have been traveling throughout the country, instructing other police departments on how you respond to a movement like this. And there are lots of other police departments studying this very carefully. And part of that is, well, what sort of legal liability ensued? And so I do think that there's a really important role for these sorts of lawsuits, especially credible lawsuits, as this one clearly is, to show that the response to the movement at Standing Rock is not actually a paragon of what should be followed, but in at least many respects should be a cautionary tale for police departments, considering in the future, like, okay, you have a large group of people gathered together in speech and prayer. What do you do? Well, the answer isn't what Morton County and the state of North Dakota did.
I think that's good. All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for joining me to talk about this important topic, and I'll keep following the case and the lawsuit. And as we get closer to the trial date, I'll want to talk to you again just to make sure everything's good. So is there any, in your mind, obviously this is speculative, this is probably the most speculative question that I'll ask, but settlements are always talked about. Is that something, do you feel like there's any chance that you'd reach a point where they would want to settle, or are you intent to take this to trial?
I think it depends a lot on our clients. So the plaintiffs in this case, it's ultimately their decision.
Right.
I mean, settlement is always a possibility. I'm not sure in a case like this whether or not the defendants are going to be willing to do what would be necessary to make this case settle. As I've seen at Standing Rock, it seems like the officials in question are so dead set against admitting any possible responsibility for what they've done that it's hard to know. But like you point out, most cases do settle. I think it's something like 98% of cases settle. It's a relative rarity that a case goes to trial. I would put the odds of our case going to trial as significantly greater than the average case, but beyond that, it's hard to speculate, in part because I don't know what sort of settlement offers they would make and what the plaintiffs in this case would feel about.
And certainly if TigerSwan or some of these other officials don't want to admit harm, then that's not justice. I mean, in the end, a settlement where they're not taking responsibility, it doesn't have much value for the people whose rights you're protecting. So
I mean, I don't want to put words in the mouth of the plaintiffs here, but I think that you're right in saying that if there's no admission of liability, it certainly decreases the value of whatever else is part of the settlement.
All right. Well, it was good to talk to both of you. Thank you, Bernard and Noah. Thank you for joining me to talk. And you have a good rest of your afternoon. And we'll catch up later to see how this lawsuit's going and how it fits into the larger issues around policing of people and as they engage in their First Amendment rights.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin.
All right, I'll let you go.
Take care.
All right, everyone. So I'm just going to check in and want to cover this with you. Let's see here. Give me one moment. I'm going to pull up something as I transition on to our next topic here before I wrap up here. All right. That was important to cover. So I'm going to leave the coverage of what's happening in Ecuador with the elections. I'm going to come back to that. We've got a journalist colleague, Ben Norton, who has been there in Ecuador following what's happening on the ground. I expect to interview him at the end of the week for podcast Unauthorized Disclosure. Rania and I will talk to him about what he's been seeing on the ground, and just to say we have a good person who follows this show, this stream here, Julio. So a shout to Julio, and I know that you're concerned about the elections in Ecuador and what Araúz in the second round is doing. And how he's going to fare against the puppet Yaku Perez. I'm learning more about Yaku, but I know that Ben Norton did coverage for the Gray Zone on this man and the sort of support that he's receiving from the United States. It's clearly to divide the left. And what was it? The banker candidate did not fare very well. Lenin Moreno goes out of power weak. It's clear that the right-wing politics that he stood for and what he did against Assange, the extent to which he was using government to retaliate and oppress the left, to go after and criminalize Rafael Correa. It's very evident that backfired and did not work. And now the question is going to be, how triumphant will the left be against these neoliberal forces, against the IMF-backed forces, the CIA-aligned forces that are known to meddle in Latin America? We know that in Bolivia, he did not win initially. that Evo Morales had to flee, and it fell on a movement to remain strong and to beat back these dark forces that were trying to tear apart the country of Bolivia until they did have an election and they were able to win. And then Evo Morales was able to come back to Bolivia. And so they're rebuilding their country, having beaten the fascist seeds that were planted in their country that were ominous. There's still a lot that they have to do and be concerned about. You're never done fighting off the United States empire and what it is intent to do to these countries. You're never done protecting your country from the vultures that are circling in U.S. corporations who want access to your resources, those minerals, those gas reserves, or any other things that they feel they can exploit within your country. But you know that you had a strong movement on the ground that was able to defend and create the possibility of democracy prevailing. And certainly in Ecuador, where you think about earlier in the pandemic, I'm sure Julio can react to this, that there were bodies of people who were being seen on the streets of some of these Ecuadorian cities that were dead from the pandemic. The absolute failure of these, so I'll broaden it out and say Western corporations that want to get their hands on resources and minerals inside of Ecuador and anything else that they can exploit. But earlier on in the pandemic, we know that there was there were bodies that were just laying out. The dead were just laying out on the streets in some of these Ecuadorian cities, a symbol of the neglect of the government when it came to protecting people in this crisis. And so now, won't there be a runoff? I know an open question is whether there actually has been fraud, and perhaps Arauz did prevail in the sense that there should be no runoff, that the margin was wide enough that there should be no runoff triggered. But then if there isn't a runoff, what we're going to hear is that the elections were not free and fair, and that there is some kind of fraud happening on the part of the left against this US-backed candidate, and that there should be more voting. The absence of going to a runoff, and they've suggested there's going to be a runoff before I think all the votes were counted. So, if a bunch of votes come in and it becomes clear that Arauz is in fact the next leader of Ecuador, and there shouldn't be a runoff, I do think we're going to see this backlash against Ecuador. And so essentially they've got the US puppet waiting in the wings to try and beat the real threat, the one that threatens the capitalist interests in Ecuador, which is Arauz. And so I'll return to this more substantively towards the end of the week. There will be a video posted, on Sunday. Unauthorized disclosure episodes go up on Sunday, but I'm going to talk to Ben Norton about this to get some on the ground insight. He did actually travel there. That's journalism. He isn't one of these pundits sitting in his ivory tower at the New York Times pontificating on what it means that Moreno has lost. And obviously my angle of interest isn't limited, but does include what happened to Julian Assange and the way in which he was tossed out of the embassy, denied his right of asylum, or had that taken away. And Julio, thank you. You're throwing in that Yaku will join Lasso, who are both on the right. Len and Moreno did not worry about COVID-19 and that there were long lines for voting. There are many, many videos out there of lines that were nearly sparked riots, right? It seems like there was quite a potential for danger to happen, in the sense that people were furious they were not being given access to the polls, that they were having to wait for hours upon hours, and were they even going to be able to vote? I think very similar to the United States, where people are in line just an hour before polls are supposed to close, and the votes are going to start getting counted, and they're still there. I'm not familiar with the case of the Native woman jailed for a firearm. You'll have to be more specific on what that. Oh, is it? Oh, are you referring? This is a U.S. case. Are you referring to? I believe her name was. Her name was Red. I know what you're referring to. I just can't come up with her name. She did have a case. She was charged with a felony. It was hold on. You're hearing the furious type. Her name was Red Fawn, right? I believe that was it. Red Fawn Phalus. She was sentenced to nearly 5 years. She was involved in the protests around Standing Rock. She pled guilty to a count of civil disorder and a count of possession of a firearm. She fired the gun 3 times during an October. Well, sorry. She accepted an agreement in which she agreed to stuff that, whether she did or not, she wanted to make sure she didn't go to jail for a longer period of time. We need to understand political cases and what happens to people who are imprisoned, basically put in jail as political prisoners and threatened with lengthy sentences if they don't agree that they were somehow involved in the crime alleged. So she copped to being involved in firing a gun 3 times during an October 2016 clash with law enforcement and opponents of the Dakota Access Pipeline. But nobody was injured, and the U.S. Attorney's Office maintains she refused orders to move off private property. This was a major political case in the No DAPL movement, in terms of the No DAPL movement. I think that's what you're talking about. Red Dawn Phalus, or Red Fawn Phalus, yes. And so she had a sentence. She was granted a sentence. And all right, so sorry about that. I'm back, and I think we're still going. I just had a little glitch there. The thing I want to cover before I wrap up the stream is to say a few words about Karen Lewis, who was the Chicago Teachers Union president in Chicago. She was a major figure. I myself, I didn't know her. I'm not directly involved in doing journalism that covers the Chicago Teachers Union, but I have written some articles on their efforts to struggle for education justice. They're now in a very intense battle with the city to come up with a plan for reopening schools that does support the safety of everyone who is going to return to those buildings. That would include teachers, that would protect the parents so that the virus does not get brought back home, that would protect students who are going to go back to those schools. And she was a major figure, although she had health issues that disrupted her chances. She did at one point run a campaign where she was hoping to be the candidate who faced off with Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, that utterly loathsome figure who we have treated. He's had his base of operations in Chicago for some time. And this is the man who was chief of staff in the Obama administration, a reprehensible figure through and through, lied or concealed evidence of a murder that was committed by Chicago police against Laquan McDonald, which is why he's become so detestable. He couldn't even hold a job as a contributor at The Atlantic because people there were so outraged over him. He's a contributor at ABC with Chris Christie and is constantly dribbling out garbage about the state of the Democratic Party and what they should do about the economy. And he's pushing failed deficit hawkery, and everything he has to say is so horribly out of touch with what needs to be said. But any of his friends or owners in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or other people who he might be counting on to maintain his connections, if he has any other political plans in his future, and I really don't know if that's possible at this point. He's a toxic figure, but Karen planned to take him on, but she had a brain tumor and had to end her campaign a while ago. The 2012 strike in Chicago, where the Chicago Teachers Union prevailed, was an amazing event. I went out on the streets and followed those demonstrations. They were fighting for all children and fighting for equity in schools, for underserved communities, especially. Rahm Emanuel had shut down 50 schools in the city, those mostly impacting Black and brown neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. And this is where I'm based, so it's very personal to me. Let me just, so that you can get I'm going to read this statement that was put out by the Chicago Teachers Union, and I want to put up a photo of Karen Lewis while I read this. So just going to scroll through, bring this photo up here. And here we go. Got her photo here. Share screen. I want to share. Try to be smooth here, but technology is not always as smooth as we want. All right, so this comes from the Chicago Teachers Union, and the woman you see down in the bottom right with her hand raised, that's Karen Lewis, for those of you who aren't familiar. But you may have noticed her name on social media. There's a lot of progressives and socialists who recognize the role she played in the movement for social justice, the larger movements for social justice. She was a towering figure in the city of Chicago, as far as someone who could represent a challenge to the political machine in the city. And it's a Democratic Party political machine. There was nobody who could top her. And so I'm sorely disappointed that she had the health problems that she had to deal with over the last years of her life, because it definitely cut short a story that it was already remarkable, but there could have been much more that she was going to give. and had the ability to do. She was that respected in the city. So this comes from the Chicago Teachers Union, who, as I said, are deep in the middle of a struggle right now for a fair agreement with the city of Chicago for reopening schools. And without one, if they can't get one, there may be a teacher strike. The union writes, "Our union is in deep mourning today at the passing of our sister, our leader, and our friend, President Emerita Karen G.J. Lewis. We are sending heartfelt condolences to her husband, John, and her surviving family and friends. She will be dearly missed. Karen taught us how to fight. She taught us how to love. She was a direct descendant of the legendary Jackie Vaughn, the first Black female president of our local, that's the union. Both were fierce advocates for educators and children, but where Jackie was stately elegance. Karen was a brawler with a sharp wit and an Ivy League education. She spoke 3 languages, loved her opera and her show tunes, and dazzled you with her smile. You could stare down the most powerful enemies of political education and defend our institution with a force rarely seen in organized labor. She bowed to no one and gave strength to tens of thousands of Chicago teachers, union educators who followed her lead and who live by her principles to this day. Karen had 3 questions that guided her leadership. Does it unite us? Does it build our power? Does it make us stronger? Before her, there was no sea of red, the sea that now stretches across our nation. She was the voice of the teacher, the paraprofessional, the clinician, the counselor, the librarian, and every rank and file educator who worked tirelessly to provide care and nurture for students. The single parent who fought tremendous odds to raise a family, and the laborer whose rights commanded honor and respect. She was a rose that grew out of Southside Chicago concrete, filled with love for her Kenwood Broncos alumni to not only reach great heights, but to elevate everyone she led to those same heights. And Kenwood is a part of Chicago, and the sea of red. That's why, I'm wearing a little red underneath my sweater today for Karen. But Karen did not just lead our movement. Karen was our movement. In 2013, she said that in order to change public education in Chicago, we had to change Chicago and change the political landscape of our city. Chicago has changed because of her. We have more fighters for justice and equity because of Karen and because she was a champion, the people's champion. And that's true. There has been at least 5 or 6 democratic socialists, people who have open socialist politics, elected to our city's, the city council here in the city of Chicago. People like Carlos Ramirez Rosa, and some of these local politics are outside of what you all focus on nationally and internationally. But it's definitely true that there are changes in the city, and there are changes in the way that people think about activism in the city because of her. How people are more willing to make plays for power in the city because she made them think about going beyond just their union organizing and made them consider what it would be like if the more left forces in the city were able to have some influence at City Hall. So I think that's part of the backlash. That's what you're seeing from Lori Lightfoot and others in the city, why she's going on television on CNN and MSNBC. And while school reform groups, as they call them, school reform groups, these neoliberal groups that say they're for school choice, which is a Trojan horse for a lot of horrible things, they are very irate with the union because they know that nothing they're saying negatively is going to stick. The teachers union is a very powerful force here in the city of Chicago, has made a lot of inroads with parents and students. They're very consistent in the paths that they forge, whereas Lori Lightfoot's leadership is rocky and inexact and impulsive And she definitely doesn't send the same message on a daily basis. It all is about her and her own interests, what she thinks is a victory for her administration, and she wants the union to submit to her. And so far, she's failed because she doesn't have that kind of authority. So she needs to good faith. She needs to go out there and at least pretend to in good faith bargain. And so far, that's been a total fail. The rest of the statement here is that our hearts are heavy today, but it brings us joy to know that Karen has joined Jackie Vaughn, Marion Stamps, Addie Wyatt, and Willie Barrow as the vanguard of Black women who have forged a heroic path of labor, justice, and civil rights in our city. Karen now sits among them and guides our every move and is guiding our vision for the schools our students and their families deserve. There's another statement that I have here for her. And I'll just, again, this was important to me. So I'm going to read another thing from a coalition in Chicago that this is United Working Families, so a group of progressives. So more background for those of you who might be interested in this figure. Again, as we've seen teachers unions take stands over the last decade, a lot of them drew inspiration from Karen as a influential leader. And I think some of these teacher union strikes that have taken place, where you've seen in cities you never predicted to see strikes, they were recalling the work of Karen and others in the Chicago Teachers Union as an example of what they could do and how they could overcome certain oppressive arrangements imposed upon them by city governments in order to win higher teacher pay or to win new standards in their schools or win changes for their schools that would make life better for students as well as teachers. So this coalition says, to paraphrase Fred Hampton, Karen Lewis dared us to struggle and dared us to win. She was a Black chemistry teacher from the South Side of Chicago who remade the political fabric of our city and nation and touched hundreds of thousands of lives in the process, including my own. This is coming from Emma Ty, is writing this. She's involved in this United Working Families group. The 2012 strike put tens of thousands of people in the streets of Chicago saying not only that we wanted, but that we deserved and could win the schools and the city that we had been told was out of reach. The strike put Black, Latinx, and working class people in a workforce that is overwhelmingly women in the streets to say the schools and city belong to us. That strike changed my whole concept of what I thought we could win. It transformed what I even let myself imagine. It changed the political landscape of the possible in Chicago and around the country, touching off a wave of strikes that continue to this day that have put ideas like a general strike back on the table for the first time in generations. Karen's leadership planted the seed for what would grow to become United Working Families, with Democrats and Republicans working together to close schools, bust unions, and bail out the banks, the big banks. Karen dared us to imagine a political party of our own. She answered the call to run for mayor against Rahm Emanuel before she was tragically sidelined by illness. She dared us to believe a Black teacher from the South Side of Chicago could be mayor simply by having the power of the people behind her, and in doing so, laid the foundation for so many of the working class Black and Latinx candidates that UWF has backed since then. We didn't win all those fights, but Karen taught me that the point is not to only take on the immediately winnable, but the point is to dare and to struggle, and in so doing, to make a different future possible. We send our love and our condolences. And so, and then these are some groups. And again, for anybody who might stumble upon this, I don't know if any of you have any affinity for groups in Chicago, but if someone happens to stumble upon this, there are groups like Asada's Daughters, Good Kids, Bad City, Students Strike Back, the South Side Together Organizing for Power organization, HANA, FYSH, AAAJ Kinetic Youth Group, and the Chicago Freedom School, that are all places with energy from youth and organizers that represent what Karen was about. And their projects, as I said, led by the youth. And they all have ways for people to donate. So sometimes when things like this happen, when we lose figures, you say in their honor, where could you give to continue their traditions? These are groups that people are donating to today. And again, I'm not necessarily just saying that to you. I'm also mentioning that today these groups are seen as the next generation, where we're going to find the next Karen Lewises. They're going to come from these groups here in Chicago that have people who represent these communities that are disadvantaged in Chicago. And I think that's where there's hope. That's where you see people who are likely to rise up. And I look forward to seeing who these next generation of leaders are going to be. And as I said before, and as all these people are saying, Karen really was an inspirational figure. So I'm going to take this down and let me look and see if there's anything else. Looking through your comments here. Greg, you have a question about kinetic justice. We're going to have a follow-up that will be published at Shadowproof this week. There was some retaliation against these organizers that were in the Free Alabama movement, and it came after Ella Fassler did her story. We have a follow-up that will be coming, so stay tuned. I don't have all the details, otherwise I'd be happy to share them right now, but that's something that Ella is working on for us. And once we have that story, we'll be sharing it widely so that people can hear. He's a kind of whistleblower. Swift Justice, Kinetic Justice, these are people who are leading, organizing inside of prisons. They're jailhouse lawyers. Also, they expose misconduct on the part of or prison staff, and makes them targets for this retaliation. And that is why we're concerned, and everyone has understandable concerns about what is going on with them. When you lose communication with people like Kinetic Justice, you're worried. So you hope that something serious didn't happen. And it takes the journalism and it takes the activism that is following and tracking this to keep it out in the open and make it harder for authorities to get away with whatever cruelty they are handing out against people like Kinetic. So that's a good question. And thanks, Greg, for asking it before I log off here. Again, so in case anybody stumbles upon this live stream, I'm going to put this here. This is the newsletter, dissenter.substack.com, where people can go to subscribe for updates on whistleblower stories and coverage of the Julian Assange case, the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's case. And then we have the Dissenter Weekly Show on Thursdays at about 4 o'clock Eastern time every week. And then we've been putting together these streams, these conversations with guests like Bernard and Noah. Last week, I talked to Andrew Perez, who is with the Daily Poster. Exceptional work. You have to go there and catch all the updates related to the stimulus checks or these survival checks and how Democrats are accommodating the calls from the right to means test and lower the threshold so that less people in the middle class, especially those hit in the last year, do not receive the checks. It's abominable. There's not this kind of action around ensuring that the bailouts for corporate executives or the money that's going to go to corporations and businesses. There's not this much concern about what they're going to do with the billions, if not trillions of dollars that get doled out. But you say you're going to send not $2,000 checks as promised, but you say you're going to send $1,400 checks to people. And immediately everyone's a deficit hawk and everyone wants to know what we are going to be able to do after, or what we'll have to do after, what kind of austerity is going to be needed after we give people this money. And everyone's concerned that the money, it may be misplaced to give people $1,400 checks. And then we have these conversations that have no context, with these numbers that have no meaning to people outside the wonks and the people at the New York Times and Washington Post who are not part of the classes of people who would benefit from these checks. And they're making money. They're not eligible. They're not likely to be sent $1,400 at all. They don't need this money. And they're talking about it. Should it be 55,000 that it cuts off? How about 60,000? Should it stay 75,000? And now, Janet Yellen wants to weigh in and say it should be 60,000, and she's getting paid $800,000 for speeches to companies. So, clearly she doesn't have to be concerned about this, and she's probably doesn't spend a lot of time with people who have to worry about whether they're going to get a survival check or not from the government in the next months. I mean, when are these going to be sent out? When are we going to have the relief deal? The relief deal could have been inked weeks ago, right when Biden entered the White House, but we're waiting. And then it gets worse when you're talking about minimum wage and whether we're going to raise the federal minimum wage to $15, and you can't do it during a pandemic. We're going to wait until 2025 because there are businesses and other places that would be under too much stress, and we wouldn't want that to happen. But then there's all this talk about how this might not be the time to do it, and we can't do it this way because we don't have this the 60 votes, and if we do it with 50 votes and a tiebreaker, is that process a way that we can get? And all of this talk about the way procedure works, all of the process questions lose sight of what is really happening to people who are struggling out there and what's going on in this country with 3,000 people dying daily from this global pandemic, with a variant of this virus, multiple variants that are mutating, with questionable reporting about what the efficacy is of these vaccines when it comes to protecting people from this spread, what it means as far as the joblessness. Lots of people laid off in the last months. The economy isn't getting better. It's not like the labor market is getting better where more hiring is happening. There's still a lot of stress. Some of these businesses and corporations are doing better than ever. Their stocks are high, but that doesn't mean it's good for people who are employees. And so all of these issues are missing from conversations, but not over at the Daily Poster. Andrew Perez is on top of all of these critical matters. And that's the whole team there with David Sirota and Julia Rock and Walker Bragman. They're doing good work. They're using Substack in the way that Substack should be used, to not just be a sounding board for your own commentary and reactions. They're bringing in people's voices who are impacted by this crisis, and they're doing reporting. They're following the money. They're seeing as the conflicts of interest. Why are these groups telling us we shouldn't get $2,000 checks? It's because they come from the business community, or they come from corporations, or they come from a neoliberal school of thinking. And we need to know who these people are. We need to name names, and we need to out them, and people need to see them, and they need to be embarrassed. And if we have the rare moments where the White House is attacking someone like Larry Summers because what he is saying is so ridiculous and stands to obstruct progress to such a degree that people might not get the relief they need, I think we should welcome that. I'm grabbing my popcorn and I'm eating my bucket of popcorn, and I'm enjoying anything that anyone in the Biden administration wants to say to attack Larry Summers, because fuck that guy. But thank you, everyone, for watching this broadcast. Yeah, that's right, Greg. Carlin said they do not give a fuck about us at all, at all, at all. It's very true. Julio, all the best to you in Ecuador. We'll keep following, keep a close watch on what's going on in your country. I definitely feel a responsibility to see that the forces of democracy prevail against the United States government as it meddles. Hey, let me just be consistent. I'm supposed to be a good liberal and oppose election meddling. So if that's happening, which we know it's probably happening, but gonna stay on the election meddling beat and follow whatever happens with the runoffs in Ecuador. And I'm not going to turn my attention away from Ecuador until we see the people behind Arauz and others prevail. And I want to know, if maybe Arauz taking power, and if we see Assange end up being able to win his case, does this mean maybe Julian Assange could come live in Ecuador? Is he going to go back to Australia, or is he going to go to a Latin American country? I don't know. Something to keep talking about. We just had a bunch of people join the stream, so I don't know who found this, but I am wrapping up. But since all of a sudden there are about 40 more people who are watching, I'll let you all know that if you go back to the beginning of this, once this video archives, you can watch the conversation with Bernard Harcourt and Noah Smith-Drelich, or Smith, I don't think I'm saying it, Smith-Drelich. There you go. That's his last name. And we talked about this lawsuit defending the First Amendment rights of water protectors. That is unfolding. Important civil liberties matter, especially in the context of pushing for new laws to go after alleged domestic terrorism. It's what we always hear, that there needs to be crackdowns on protests to stop the threats of rioting or violence. And so this is an important case, protecting people who were using a public road to speak. And then after that, I talked a little about the Ecuador elections, let people know there's going to be an interview with Ben Norton for unauthorized disclosure that will be posted on this channel. Rania Kalik and I do this podcast. And then I paid tribute, or I read the tributes that are coming from the city of Chicago, from the Chicago Teachers Union, for Karen Lewis, who was the president of CTU, was a larger than life, an exceptional figure when it came to union organizing, and very inspirational person. And I did spent some time on her legacy, and so that's the stream. So go back and watch that once this is all archived. And until Wednesday, hopefully I'll be here. I don't know if there will be a guest that I'll be talking to, but I'll be here Wednesday, and I'll do a stream for 45 minutes to an hour at least, cover some of the stories that are major and likely being ignored. We're all going to be seeing the major cable news networks try to get as much out of this impeachment trial that they can. They're very upset, right? Because Donald Trump has disappeared. So this impeachment trial is a chance to bring him back and cash in on it for a little bit. So not that Donald Trump shouldn't be impeached, but it's going to be impeachment, and everything else that is happening totally ignored. And not that some of these things that I talk about are covered on a daily basis anyway. A lot of it is underreported and ignored. Thank you all for tuning in. I will be here on Wednesday and then on Thursday for the Dissenter Weekly show. So until then, I'll see you around.